Emperor Demarch, aka Premier Spons, notoriously had 666 wives, all of whose heads are popularly rumored to have been chopped off for slightly undercooking one of his meals once. Nobody questions the official narrative that they all went on an extended holiday due to the prevailing sense of dread that it won't end well for anybody that does. There is a rumor within a rumorception, that one of his wives, Anastasia, might have survived and really is on an extended holiday on a blizzard-prone offshore colony called Zibotsria. This island is understood to be a very popular holiday resort, with many people going there on extended vacations in such an enthusiastic rush that they don't give prior notice to any of their friends or family, and apparently enjoy themselves there so much that they never contact said friends and family ever again. Coincidentally, many of the people who go to Zibotsria on holiday are members of heavily persecuted groups in society, such as left-handers, eons, transsexuals, homosexuals, Mower show apologists, Bestian sympathizers, vegetarians, and vegans, the last two of which are persecuted the most aggressively of all in Arvich, for some reason. It's popularly theorized that the idea of getting away from it all really appeals to these sorts of people, and that's why they all go there and then never, ever come back. In fact, the government once proposed to send all captured illegal immigrants to Zibotsria, citing that it would be a very pleasant place for them to live and they would really like it there. This was met with a degree of skepticism at the time, since Zibotsria had recently undergone several bloody civil wars as well as one or two genocides in the preceding week, but the government assured the public that those days will eventually be far behind them now, and also said let's not talk about the past, let's talk about the present, which settled that matter conclusively. Some commentators also questioned why the illegal immigrants would want to go to a current imperial colony when they had been trying to get out of imperial territory to begin with, and further questioned why none of the politicians pushing so aggressively for this development are willing to move to Zibotsria themselves to demonstrate what a great place it is to live, since they're apparently so sure it's what's best for people whose circumstances they know absolutely nothing about and whose relocation preferences they have made no attempt whatsoever to elicit from them. Funnily enough, all such public commentators seemingly had a change of heart and decided to go on an extended holiday to Zibotsria themselves, which is believed to have started the whole holidaying trend that continues to this very day. Manifestation evolution, or manifestism, is the widely accepted mechanism by which all living things are believed to have come into being. Although scientific support for its veracity is currently very limited, especially with regard to creatures such as fairies and gnomes, the scientific community expresses hope and faith that ongoing efforts will corroborate its universality. The concept is named after its origin point, the Manifest, Holy Book of the Captained Religion, which goes into incredibly elaborate detail on the nature of life. Although it had simply been taken on faith for centuries, recent scientific efforts have begun to corroborate some of its claims, with the discovery of genetics, or DNA, as a cornerstone in manifest vindication, in a world that the captaincy laments is increasingly deviating from traditional manifest literacy principles. To paraphrase the insanely long-winded, several thousand-page diatribe that the Manifest goes into on the subject, manifestation evolution is a theoretical model to account for the development of life in the world in terms that sapient beings can understand, which the Manifest asserts as the captain's absolute, incontrovertible word, while simultaneously encouraging all sapient species to use the gifts of science and reason to verify its claims to their own satisfaction, once they are ready and able. Essentially, every living thing contains a collection of chemical compounds referred to as genes. When a creature reproduces, these genes are passed on to the child in a very slightly altered form by a process known as random mutation. Over the course of many generations, as a matter of statistical inevitability, the cumulative effect of these mutations in an environment will lead to those creatures that don't survive and produce children fading away, while the creatures who do survive and produce healthy children will thrive. This biological filtration process is known as natural selection, and the overall state of affairs deriving from the combination of this and the aforementioned random mutation is referred to as survival of the fittest. Although very few in mainstream society would ever question manifestation evolution on any level, it has recently been garnering detractors. One of the most prominent of these is P.J. Masker's, an archbishop, who excoriates Manifestian evolution and its advocates with a fervor that borders to many on hateful, arguing that the concept is mired in circular reasoning, and that a literal interpretation of the manifest is out of the question on the specific matter of evolution. Maskers has a fringe support base within the captaincy, including Archbishops Fedphelps and Pilkin Balloonster. While Maskers and his movement insist they are rationally grounded in their position, they are perceived by many to be deeply bitter and resentful towards the beliefs and people they disagree with. The impression comes across that Maskers and his supporters have a visceral contempt for those who hold to manifestism that goes far beyond any kind of rational considerations and manifests itself in the deeply persecutory attitudes they exhibit on a constant basis, such as Phelps's tendency to picket fellow priests' funerals with placards containing messages like "the genes are a lie" and "there is an insufficient evidentiary basis to justify belief in manifestation evolutionary literalism, you stupid pig-headed idiots." To elaborate on their views, the standard anti-manifestism position includes these crucial points. 1. The definition of fittest is those who survive, hence, survival of the fittest literally means survival of the survivors, a self-evident statement conveying no information whatsoever. Balloonster, in particular, is associated with this argument. 2. No evidence of the chemical DNA substance that vaguely seems to vindicate manifestism in eons and humans has been found in fairies, gnomes, and various other creatures. 3. The unicorns are not addressed in the manifest's evolutionary breakdown, which it insists is complete for all past and present evolutionary lines. Their views are seen as hateful and blasphemous by the wider public, especially so by religious people, and perhaps none more so than the unmode, such as Professors Doc Bleatlam and Kinder Surmise, who are among the most affronted of all by Maskers and his anti-manifestism movement. The public dislike of these figures is largely moved by the prevailing sense that Maskers and his comrades are using volatile scientific developments to push ulterior political and religious agendas, wanting the captaincy to exercise more power over the scientific community in process. Maskers in particular has been labeled the captain's warthog, aggressively inserting himself into intense debates with scientific authorities in pursuit of this nefarious project. He insists he is motivated purely by rational considerations. The Bestia Times talk a lot about the current year mandate and how important it is for society's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors to change in the light of it. Readers writing in to question what exactly makes the current year so special, and what makes the Times staff so sure that said current status is some kind of inherent mandate for the kinds of deeply divisive political action they relentlessly advocate for, have been met with accusations that the writers are gangrenous humans, or gammons, a term that the publication uses to refer to humans they perceive to not be doing enough to redress the plight of eons, and fake eons, or fake eons, which the paper uses to refer to eons they perceive to be traitors to their kind. This has led some commentators to wonder if the many terms that the Bestia Times like to use, such as gammon and fakeon and humans, come together with their appeals to things like the current year and representation and guilt, are in fact thinly veiled cultural battering rams that the paper insidiously and manipulatively exploits to stir up emotive tribal agitation in service of their deeper political agendas. Matters aren't helped by the fact that over 4/5 of the paper's writing and editorial staff are confirmed Marxists, and 100% of them are humans from privileged backgrounds, leading some to wonder if their political writings might be a disingenuous attempt by the Concerebral elite at rabble-rousing, and that underprivileged groups, like eons, are perhaps little more to them than a useful tool to help undermine the established order, and thereby push their broadly unpopular radical ideologies in its place. There is a perception that the paper can and will abandon any and all such useful groups at the drop of a hat if they are perceived to have outlived their usefulness in helping the writers achieve their desired aims. Examples of this supposed tendency have been cited, such as when the left-handed bombers were initially heralded by the paper as wrongfully practiced and yet rightfully motivated in drawing society's attention to the plight of voiceless, oppressed groups. When it was determined that the left-handers were pushing to seal themselves off from the wider world, trying to form an isolationist society founded on anti-Marxist principles, the paper appears to have reversed its position, criticizing the direction left-handers, or leftists, were taking. This ultimately culminated in the paper withdrawing all leftist support during the Wars of the Hands, to the point that many believe the paper was effectively abandoning them to the near genocide that the leftists presciently anticipated would inevitably befall them at the rate things were going. A similar thing happened when a notorious serial killer began stalking the streets of Blackchapel, in the poor and deprived north end of Bestia. The paper took the frankly bizarre view that the killer's murder spree was actually a high-minded political act, that he intended to draw society's attention to the plight of the poor and downtrodden in the North End. In spite of severe criticism from pretty much everybody in the country, the paper stubbornly maintained this ludicrous position, until the murderer himself was moved to write them a furious letter denouncing their claims and insisting, "I just like killing people, so shut up and stop saying all that dumb stuff about me." This kind of blatantly agenda-driven nonsense was seen to reach a new low in recent weeks, in which the Times has forcefully pushed the notion that Bestia's much-loved, centuries-old delicacy of fish and chips is the most disgusting food item in the entire history of the universe. Given the many such incidents, where the paper ostensibly hijacked tragic events to presumptuously peddle their own politics, the Bestian public are increasingly skeptical of the paper and their integrity, thinking they may actually be quite nasty and abusive for all their claims of moral-mindedness and tolerance. Contrary to popular belief, this sentiment is also often shared by its chiefly Eon reader base, who are nevertheless steadfast in their support of the paper, feeling that for all of its obvious flaws, it remains one of the few powerful entities in the establishment of Bestia, or indeed any kind of establishment outside of the far west, doing anything of substance to try and fight Eon's corner in modern society. Even in knowledge of this, many others feel it's irresponsible of the paper's readers to support such a disingenuous and inflammatory publication, feeling it does more harm than good in society, and that its more sinister tendencies are a ticking time bomb to horrible happenings in the future. In short, nobody can agree on anything, which some say is a growing theme in the modern world, and one that looks like it might be heading to a worrying destination. The Bestia Times' notorious current year mandate, which is a concept it invokes to justify all of the political developments they seek to impose on general society, is well known and highly divisive in Bestia. In response to it, the Times' Libvative supporting rival, the Daily Bestia, has introduced its own rival political agitation vehicle, known as the Real World Mandate. The essence of this concept is that all of the political developments the paper seeks to impose on general society are justified by the fact that everybody lives in the real world, with common refrains from Daily Bestia supporters including "This is the real world, grow up out," "I grew up," or "Grow up and get a haircut, hopster," "and my wage packet is fantastic," I mean ideals are for kids. Some commentators have questioned exactly how the real world provides some kind of inherent mandate for the kinds of deeply divisive political actions that the paper relentlessly advocates for, or what makes the paper's writing and editorial staff so sure of the veracity of their perceptions concerning the nature of this real world. Some point to the fact that a strict definition of what is real and what is not is highly contested across the human and Eon races on just about every level imaginable, especially with regard to any such presumed reality's political implications. The general response to such observations by Daily Bestia and Libvative supporting commentators is that the critics' hearts pump blood around their bodies, the significance of which is a point of substantive criticism against said critics' political counterpoints has yet to be elucidated. In particular, Professor Kinder Surmise has become a staunch and unwavering advocate of the real-world mandate, arguing that recent peer-reviewed scientific developments corroborate the idea that the real world does indeed mandate key libvative political positions and agendas, with manifestation evolution in particular constituting such a profound divine commandment. For this that one of Surmise's most recently published, characteristically door-stopping books is dedicated entirely to this topic. Some have questioned if this latest in his incessant attempts to vindicate Southwing, and more specifically libertarian, politics by invoking well-established scientific concepts might possibly be more a reflection of his own personal political biases and preconceptions than it is of any intrinsic political mandate being objectively derivable from said scientific concepts. But Professor Surmise has decried such suggestions as iniquitous instruments of the forces of unreason and insists he is motivated purely by rational considerations. International Fish of Mystery James Bond is a legendary underwater secret agent whose existence is unconfirmed, even though he's very well known to land dwellers. The folklore has it he's a Sharkian bubble agent who does undercover work for water-owns on land, attempting to sabotage sinister organizations like Evil Corporation and the Bads, as well as overthrow tyrannical regimes. His famous catchphrase, "battered, not breaded," has no obvious meaning. Evil Corporation, incidentally, takes objection to the popular impression that they're evil. In fact, their official statement on the matter is, "We are not evil, we are truly committed to performance excellence and thriving in a fast-paced, dynamic working environment, and we are truly passionate about our values, all of which truly makes us stand out from the average company in the glorious Arvich Empire." Leverage. Proxification is the controversial proposal that children's wishes on the Mower show should be forcibly overturned by an appropriate adult's wish instead, such as a parent's or guardian's. The reasoning goes that since children are too immature to appreciate the gravity of either the wish on the Mower show or the actual Mower show itself, they should be obligated to make someone else's wish instead of their own, thus allowing the adult in question to effectively make multiple wishes on the Mower show. For some reason, this motion has gained a lot of traction in the adult world, with most adults expressing sympathy with the concept, while the world's children are more or less unanimous in their disapproval of it. Children in particular argue that the proposal is a thinly veiled cover that adults are using to selfishly get more wishes at the expense of the persecuted scapegoat group that child activists claim children to be. In support of this claim, the children cite a litany of other supposed examples of the adult world callously exploiting children to get what they want, including the lemonade stand industry and its infamous candy bar wages, which said industry defends as reflective of the value contributed by our truly valued child employees. The alleged tendency of parents to pressure or force their children to indulge in activities and pursue interests and careers that the parents themselves like, do, or wish they could have done, almost as though they were presumptuously and selfishly trying to live out their dreams through their own children. The haughty scolding and lecturing that adults constantly dish out to children for perceived bad behavior, as though they feel entitled to order children to behave in a way they deem appropriate. Whereas anybody treating the adult themselves in this way would almost certainly be held in contempt, with famous adult remarks on the matter including, "Stop treating me like a child, typical nanny state, and it's my life, now get off my lawn," and the private magools, which charge their child students fees for attendance that are wildly out of proportion with the earning potential of the children themselves, leading just about all children to have to rely on funding from their own parents to have any chance of acceptance. The campaigners for the motion, however, insist that they are motivated purely by rational considerations and express disgust and outrage at the children's attitudes, claiming that since they themselves had to put up with such conditions when they were children in the good old days, modern children should expect to suffer them in kind. Now get off my lawn. Synthesis, aka Mozzie, mage of the entourage of Prince Median, aka Prima Zerina, is popularly known to have never had any MP, so she has to give up HP to cast spells. That guy with the square take is a well-known tyrannical figure, who supposedly ruled over all Arvichian territory, before said territory was rescued from his monstrous grasp, by being assimilated into the wonderful, liberating Arvichian Empire. No evidence of this ruler's existence has been found outside of official Arvichian propaganda statements, and publicly questioning this has consequences of a nature you can probably guess by now. Gnomes are magical creatures that can transform themselves into florians, such as trees, plants, and shrubs. They aren't eons themselves though, and they're rarely if ever seen outside of such eon forms. Faunians aren't on friendly terms with them, in spite of the gnome's natural friendly disposition. The bungling buccaneers are so useless that they only steal from themselves, and they don't even realize they're doing it, but at least they've managed to do their job and deliver Prince Majoran, aka Prima Majorok, back home to Castle Pasty. And yet his brothers are nowhere to be found, to say nothing of Emperor Demarek, aka Premier Spots. Castle officer Steele Foxington and his worthless wingmen have been instrumental in enforcing imperial immigration policy for decades. Well, I say decades, Frog's body only joined up recently. Foxington doesn't like to talk about the wing woman he replaced. Most people don't believe the Unicorn Queen's crown still exists, but the Knights of the Round are obsessed with finding and destroying it. Rumor has it it's sealed underground in one of the Unicorn's legendary focus group facilities, and that it will bring the Queen back to life in the world's brightest hour so she can conquer and terrorize everything again. Lancelot wants to prevent this from ever happening. They don't get much respect as they run around questing, and while that may be due to their bumbling incompetence at everything they do, they still apply themselves in earnest to every task that they inevitably fail to accomplish in spectacular fashion. Mean nicknames include the Three Scrooges, the Chuckle Huckers, and the Windmill Chasers. They take offense to that last one, though, saying that incident with the windmill wasn't their fault, it was asking for it. Lancelot tends to be seen as the smartest of the three. Percival/Parsival/Percival/etc. is the strongest, and Arthur is just kind of the boring jack of all trades that nobody tends to like. Folklorists say there's a deformed and hideous creature in this world, doomed to stalk the earth for all eternity, dying and being reborn at the hands of all kinds of random and unfair death traps that he had no way to see coming. He's known by many names, such as Jack of the Lantern Springs, Will of the Whispers, and Paul Blart Mall Cop. It's said that the ghostly light of his bad collision detection can be seen floating around at the midnight hour over the fields and within the forests, right before a scream rings out and the light vanishes due to him getting blindsided by all the cheap enemy placement amid the sparsely placed health pickups. One bone-chilling account has it that one time, Jack/Will/Paul Blart's glowing light strayed farther to the west of its haunting grounds than had ever been seen before. It came to an abrupt stop when it was blocked by a rock, whereupon the apparition screamed once more, as a hole opened up from out of nowhere in the ground beneath him, and swallowed him whole before he had any chance to react whatsoever. Will the restless spirit ever make it out of his eternal prison? Or will he be forced to shell out for the strategy guide? Either way, in the meantime, it's said he likes to play tricks on people called Bernard, for some reason, being very fond of transmogrifying them, an extremely pretentious word for turn them into animals, a word that is popularly believed to have been coined by famous naturalist Calvin Hobson, even though supposedly it existed before him, despite the fact just about everybody agrees they would have never heard of the word if it wasn't for him. We said there was more on that to follow, and here it is. This is the Bestian news at 11. The ruling Libvative party's leader, Sumpson, was fired in complete and utter disgrace upon it being discovered he had been hosting house parties with a group of hateful bullies, abusers, and inveterate liars during a hard time when the wider Bestian population was banned from meeting up with their friends and family under any circumstances. Following the revelation, the Libvative party made an official statement that they were shocked and appalled by Borald's behavior, but denounced the common suspicion that Libvative politicians made up most if not all of the attendees at these house parties. Borald was immediately replaced with an unpopular and unelected new president, whose first act was to make an extremely ill-considered speech, in which she quoted a notorious phrase from recently reinstated Arvich Central Police Chief Jim Sickrell, which somehow managed to bring the entire Bestian economy to its knees almost as soon as the speech was done. In spite of her protest that she didn't know the source of the quote, and that she definitely wasn't deliberately using it to try and pander to some of the more unsavory elements of the Libvative voter base, the unelected president was also fired in complete and utter disgrace, although some commentators felt her extremely generous pension package was inconsistent with the supposed disgrace the party held her in, to say nothing of Borald's, as well as it being disproportionate to the amount of time she had spent in office, 4 minutes, and how effectively she did her job during that time, but she set the record straight by saying that she had worked very hard for it, and ended her defense with the resounding, debate-crushing point of let's not talk about the past. Let's talk about the present. Immediately after this development, the party proceeded to replace her with yet another unelected leader, but only after having an internal party leadership contest, in which Sumpson was her chief rival, being actively supported by a large portion of the party despite having been fired in complete and utter disgrace by that same party several minutes earlier. The new leader, Doris Tronjan, was decried by the rival party, the Concerebrals, and they in tandem with large swaths of the mass media, went on full blast to run Doris's reputation completely into the ground several months before her reign began. All disgraced presidents have a 3-month notice period, saying she was the worst leader this government has ever seen, and that her party was more corrupt than it has ever been in its entire history. This came to a head at the next election, when Doris lost, following which her party and its supporters proceeded to promote a notorious and completely unevidenced conspiracy theory that the election had been rigged and a vote recount was necessary. The Concerebral supporting media decried this whole fiasco as a completely unprecedented low in Bestian politics that the Concerebrals would never stoop to, although some commentators felt the whole affair was a tad reminiscent of the time 16 years earlier when the Concerebral party and its supporting media promoted a notorious and completely unevidenced conspiracy theory that the election had been rigged and a vote recount was necessary. There were also some commentators who felt skeptical about the media's claims that Doris Tronjan and her government were the worst and most corrupt that Bestia had ever seen, citing the fact that the media has said this about literally every single president and government that has ever been in power at any point throughout Bestia's entire 30-year history. Critics' concerns might have been justified, however, as Doris and her government, who have for some reason invoked emergency powers, have proceeded to spearhead an extremely polarizing and inflammatory movement to block the newly proposed bill that would have demolished one of the 5 walls that currently separate Bestia from Arvich. Her government's position is that Bestia has a democratic imperative to separate itself as much as possible from the undemocratic Arvichian state, whose leaders and figureheads are not elected by the general public and who use insidious and manipulative methods to control the political process and act like tyrannical dictators, actively and deliberately limiting the degree to which citizens and the individual politicians that those citizens support can meaningfully influence the political process. Critics of this motion have suggested that the matter should be put to the Bestian population for a public vote, but the government have condemned this suggestion as undemocratic. Things have reached the point that increasing numbers of Bestian have come to feel the famed Bestian dream isn't really working out. For the country's monarch and his royal court, this cuts them very deeply. The Goskireth, aka Bolzome, sect is growing thanks partly to their cool, hip marketing towards young people, convincing them the captaincy is stuffy, old-fashioned, and overly scientific. The manifest is notoriously technical in places, especially on the subject of evolution, which infamously has a clinical breakdown that lasts for literally thousands of pages, droning on inscrutably about random mutations and statistical environmental adaptation processes that nobody really understands, leading even some captaincy scholars to suggest it shouldn't be taken literally. The captaincy is trying to stay relevant, but is more commonly seen as selling out. It's Grace's opinion that the captain deliberately wrote the technical parts of the manifest to mislead people into thinking the universe could be understood rationally through scientific and mathematical analysis, giving people the comfort of being little, inconsequential parts of a much larger and more important whole, when the reality is the universe is a finely tuned torture chamber in which all living things have been intelligently designed to have the most painful and miserable existence possible, which Grace refers to as the worst of all possible worlds. In her view, this condition leads people to languish in their own misery before forming tribes that angrily persecute each other to desperately try to fill their own void and grasp for a sense of comfort and security. This tribalism continues until people start to feel maybe they can overcome their own pain and weaknesses and learn to look past their differences and love each other, only for all such attempts to brutally fail and collapse them into even deeper misery and tribalism. This traps the whole world in a futile, nihilistic, spiraling cycle of misery, cruelty, and pain. Thus Grace sees manifestion evolution, with its famous random mutation and natural selection principles, as a comforting delusion for weak people who can't listen to reason and confront the brutal reality of what life truly is. She thinks this is why people cling to it and put so much stock in its relatively limited supporting evidence, which only leads to their further suffering in this life and the brutal dismantling of their hopeful fantasies in the next. To Grace, this, as with everything, is all part of the captain's divine plan, which she notoriously maintains is completely without purpose or meaning despite the obviously inherent purposefulness of how she characterizes it. To other captaincy detractors, most famously Professor Catherine Dunkirk, the scripture's overly intelligible scientific reasoning is all proof that the manifest is meaningless, and the captain doesn't even exist. Everyone knows about Grace's theological stances, of course, even more than they do Dunkirk's. Grace used to be a traveling preacher, scouring the whole of Dystonia, aka Arvich, and shrieking at anyone she could find about her religious beliefs, to the point that she and her views became a bedrock of Dystonian popular culture. Known as the Mad Wolf, she would clamber onto any higher vantage point she could find, usually in highly populous and busy areas, and shout until she had everybody's attention. It was always reported that she was hyper-attentive to her audience, fixing her gaze upon every single one over the course of her speech, as if she were trying to engage with every individual present, as well as anybody who was just passing by and paying her no attention at all, almost as if she were looking for someone in particular. With that said, it's always been said that Grace seems to be hyper-aware of her surroundings in general, always monitoring the people and places around her, with nobody being able to surprise or even sneak up on her without her knowledge. A common misconception in the world of the Mower show, where most people are painfully well aware of Grace and her views, is that the itinerant priestess herself is some kind of ironic hipster atheist who just uses the captain as some sort of pretentious metaphor or something for life being horrible. But anyone who's ever dared to suggest such a thing to her face has been left in no doubt whatsoever of the absolute sincerity of her beliefs, her searing red pupils burning brightly with an unmistakably earnest fire, as she erupts like a volcano, and preaches her fire and brimstone with such fervor as could shake the heavens. Although in oddly stark contrast to this, whenever someone asks her why on earth she believes the captain is anything like what she says, she flatly yet sternly responds, "I don't believe, I know." The Imperial March is the Arvichian military's official marching song, and also the Arvichian national anthem. It should be 20 verses long, but Demarik's singing cuts off in this official recording because he was distracted mid-song by a sausage roll, and everyone was too afraid to ever ask him to redo it. This is canon. The Arvich Empire operates on a system known as trickling-down economics, among other names. The basic concept is that the more wealth and power that is put in the hands of those who already have the most wealth and power, the better it will be for the whole of society, including those at the very bottom. The analogy that the Arvichian aristocracy like to use to explain how this works is to imagine a large reservoir filled with golden water. If this water were in the hands of the little people, i.e. 99.9% of the population, then the water would be completely wasted since they wouldn't know how to use it, and they don't know what's best for themselves anyway. Instead, the water should be actively siphoned out of the reservoir and funneled into a sprinkler system that trickles down the golden water back to the peasants, who would have otherwise had access to it already. Thus the upper classes are constantly trickling down a shower of gold on the general public, who should all be very grateful to their rightful superiors for doing this to them, and thereby sparing them the terrible burden of managing their own resources for themselves. Despite this, not everyone is fond of the trickling-down philosophy, especially in Bestia. Some don't really see the sense in how taking money out of the hands of the wider population is the best way to put money in the hands of the wider population, especially since Arvich's economy is grounded on aristocrats and corporate executives who are generally one and the same, actively trying to hoard as much money into themselves and their corporations as possible in pursuit of their own growth, even at the expense of wider society. Some also find it curious that the advocates of this system are almost invariably members of the upper classes themselves, and that everything about it seems tailor-made to centralize money and power into the upper classes and benefit them at the expense of everyone else, almost as if the entire ideology were a thinly veiled cover for their own desire to maintain their own extremely privileged status and hoard everything for themselves that might otherwise be available to other people. Some also see a double standard in how the ideology's advocates seem confident that the lower classes don't know what's best for themselves and wouldn't be able to handle their own money, and yet said advocates also seem confident that the upper classes know exactly what's best not only for themselves but also for those same lower classes, despite being by all appearances utterly divorced from the lower classes, scarcely even seeing or interacting with any of them at any point in their entire lives, and consistently demonstrating a profound ignorance of them on pretty much every single level imaginable. Bestian commentators are among the fiercest critics of the shower of gold belief system, claiming that Bestia has dropped it and now strives for fairness for everybody, being far better for it. Many Arvichians, however, note that these commentators are generally members of the Bestian aristocracy and upper classes themselves, who also live a life of luxury and opulence in comparison with the ongoing plight of the vast majority of the Bestian population, and who are widely seen to be similarly detached from the little people they claim to be advocating for. This common perception, which is widely held even by those who haven't undergone Arvichian re-education, is responsible for the popular term bleeding boasting Bestians. Buy things from our company corporation, CRTM or BTC for short, please don't sue us, have conducted a series of longitudinal, double-blind, peer-reviewed scientific studies on all these negative attitudes towards shower of gold economics, the results of which have recently been published in the Journal of Acceptable Scientific Truth. Their findings are that such attitudes can only be coming from brains heavily compromised by the mind virus. The Journal of Acceptable Scientific Truth is a well-respected research publisher to which BTC is a frequent contributor. Previous pieces of watershed research disseminated through the journal proved conclusively that smoking BTC-branded cigarettes is good for your health, that drinking BTC-branded alcohol will prolong your lifespan, and that vaccines produced by non-BTC pharmaceutical companies can turn humans into eons. H.C. Garcia gaily loves to play rock music, which is quite controversial for some dumb reason, and he's known as a real wild child. But there's more to him than meets the eye. The Holy Child is an ancient captaincy institution. Since time immemorial, before even the unicorns it seems, the lineage has continued unbroken. First, he or she lives out a holy childhood. Then, once of breeding age, the child has at least 2 children, if they can, to minimize any chance of the family dying out. Then, they live a life in line with the captain's teachings, striving to make the world a better place for all living things. Finally, shortly before turning 18, they embark on their holy voyage to the abyss in order to renew the seal on Goskireth. And then, without exception, they are never seen again. The Happy Little Horses book A Start to Happiness. Once upon a time there was a magical land called Horse World, where there lived horses who could speak and were somewhat intelligent, just like Horseons. They lived in an enchanted kingdom ruled by a great and wise queen. This queen was nothing like the unicorn queen your parents read to you about. She was a good, loving queen who ruled their kingdom of Horseland with love and kindness and faith in the captain. Every day, without fail, after sitting down to a scrumptious breakfast of delectable delights, she parted from her advisors with a smile to go out to the grand castle balcony. There she looked down upon the massive throng of happy little horses going about their merry lives far, far below. They were so small from so high up, they looked like ants. But they were not ants to the queen. Every one of their lives was sacred, just like the captain taught her they were. And she shouted down to the masses, "Are you happy, citizens?" And every day, as sure as she would ask the question, she would get a resounding response of, "Yes, your majesty." And then she would, still smiling, leave her subjects and discuss micro and macroeconomic socio-political policy and zeta-linear taxation mechanics with her advisors. But you don't need to know about that. It was on one of these happy days that our story begins. Queen Cuddlehearts was coming down the palatial steps to her court when she caught sight of her daughter, Princess Lanatoki, from behind, and she wasn't her usual self at all. She was looking sad. The queen went over to her and asked, "Whatever is the matter, my little sugar lump? Are you not happy?" But instead of answering, Lanatoki hid her face and turned away from her mother. Just then, a loud voice came thundering across the hall to Queen's ears. It was an advisor at the far end of the hall, shouting. He said, "Your Majesty, we must get on with the crop rotation policy discussions at once." But the queen looked back sternly and said, softly yet with force, "I have more important matters to attend to at present. I shall be with you shortly." She turned her attentions back to her daughter Lanatoki, who was still turned around. Queen walked around to her front and bent down to see her lowered face, saying, "My daughter, what is wrong?" Again Lanatoki turned away, this time to face the carpeted walkway at the hall's center, where she had faced before. The queen was deeply concerned. Happiness was very important to her. Everyone should be happy, just like the captain taught us. But her daughter's obvious melancholy seemed greater than the tall cathedral-like room they were in, with its white, marble pristine walls a sour companion to her dear daughter's sadness. "My daughter," said the queen, "it's the place of we royalty, to live our whole lives in this place, and work to better our people's lives outside of their knowing. It is the way of royalty." "I have," Lanatoki snapped back. "And," said the queen, continuing, "one day, you will leave the castle, my sweet. After you are ripe, and have blossomed into a queen, you will go on a journey, and then be assumed into the good ship by the captain. And the captain is very good indeed." Now, Lanatoki loved the captain, as all good little girls do. But the thought of the captain's promise still did not take away her tears. The queen came to the girl's front again, and the same thing happened. Back and forth they went for more than a few passes. The advisor returned, and shouted once more, "Your Majesty, crop rotation. Please. This matter cannot kept." But the queen shouted back again, and continued chasing her daughter's front, as she did so, intent on finding out what was wrong with her only child. Perceiving that she would get no response in one of her motions to Lanatoki's front, when the girl began to slink around, the queen bolted like lightning to that side, grabbed her by the chin, and brought her head up to face hers. Her daughter was crying. Through eyefuls of tears, she said plainly, "I have no friends, mother." The Far West has historically been quite insular on the world stage, being more or less shut in, until about a century and a half ago, and even afterwards it still kept mostly to itself until more recent decades. Records suggest that the East and West didn't make much in the way of efforts to engage with each other until the political ideology now known as capitalism spread from the Far West to Eastern lands, an altered version of which was swiftly adopted by the Arvich Empire, shortly after which the well-known Buy Things From Our Company Corporation, CRTM, was formed, which has since gone on to become the most powerful corporation in the entire world. Unlike in Arvich and Bestia, where private corporations are typically associated with the aristocracy and the upper classes in general, the far western corporations are far more steeped in lower-class grassroots culture, with the aristocratic classes being commonly seen as a marginalized and underrepresented group in the modern West, whose plight is largely ignored by those same corporate interests, which are far more aligned with the general masses in their practices, interests, and sympathies. This profound and fundamental difference in societal structure has led to a culture clash between the two hemispheres that is seen to be holding back integration efforts, more specifically, efforts by the Arvich Empire to integrate the West against its will. Far Western historians, however, insist that the class structure in their homeland used to be much more reminiscent of the modern East's, prior to the introduction of Marxism and the subsequent follow-on development of capitalism over 150 years ago, the latter of which fully wrested the power, wealth, and resources out of the hands of the old shoguns and their samurais, or lords, and their corporate executives in more Eastern terms, putting it directly into the hands of what can be called the peasants and working classes. This historical development is fondly regarded in the Far West, although it has always met with a very different perception by Easterners, who see the Western peasantry as tyrannical underlords in their treatment of the upper classes, who in turn are beholden to the peasants to the point they come across as slaves in all but name. The way in which aristocrats have to straighten their knee in deference to the laboring classes, in all their dealings, and the infamously paltry wages and working conditions they're expected to settle for in exchange for their services, comes across as very alarming and unnatural to Easterners. Westerners are quick to justify this by saying that their aristocrats are paid and treated in a manner consistent with the value of the services they provide to general society, which Marxism and its immediate successor, capitalism, came to reveal was actually extremely low in spite of what the upper classes had always previously insisted, and indeed still do insist in the East to this very day. The Far West civilization gradually came to discover that the supposed value of the aristocracy, together with the value of the entire middle and upper classes, was almost entirely illusory, a product of those very same middle and upper classes exploiting a legacy position of power, wealth, and influence that they had been wallowing in complacently for centuries, like entitled, spoiled little brats, having inherited the status from their ancestors, for utterly arbitrary historical reasons that were clearly exposed as redundant when the working classes took ownership of what the West called the means of production, undiscovered just how easy it was to handle most if not all of the functions necessary to a smoothly running society with barely any involvement from the middle and upper classes whatsoever. In spite of the West's pride in their ideology, the Eastern perception persists that the Western lower classes are distorting the reality of the situation, taking advantage of the power they wield to overinflate their own significance, while downplaying the importance of the middle and upper classes. In this way they are perceived to be guilty of the very same exploitation of their legacy position that they've accused the higher classes of wallowing in it complacently for over 1.5 centuries, like entitled, spoiled little brats, having inherited the status from their ancestors, for utterly arbitrary historical reasons that would be clearly exposed as redundant if the upper classes ever regained ownership of the means of production, and were elevated to the rightful position of wealth that they clearly deserved to hold over the lower classes, since then they would surely discover just how easy it is to handle most if not all of the functions necessary to a smoothly running society with barely any involvement from the lower classes whatsoever. Roni Tobinson, the Adirian and Farmy Phil the Parsimonian were pioneers in the excavations that have been sweeping the world in recent years. It all started when Farmy Phil was plowing his land and accidentally dug up a strange little cylinder with AAA written on the side of it. He showed it to his friend Roni, who immediately recognized it must have been an archaeological find. On the back of this, he had a cunning plan to buy out Phil's farm on the cheap by falsely claiming the object would corrode his crops. This worked, and Roni proceeded to head an international excavation project that uncovered all kinds of bizarre artifacts, taking all the money and glory for them while getting Phil himself to dig it all up for him. They were called the Timing Team. Roni now travels the world, craftily tricking people out of their artifact-rich land and making a fortune off of the excavations he runs on them. All the digging work is still done by Phil, who loyally obeys him without question, and is sadly too dense to realize Roni is a conniving, scheming, weaselly little slimeball who has been taking advantage of him the entire time. Roni exploited Phil for all kinds of dirty deeds over the years. One of his schemes involved the time when he and Phil were both drafted to fight in the first of the Wars of the Hands, and they were sent to join the Right Brigade at the front line to charge at a platoon of leftist cannoneers in what Roni immediately recognized would be a suicide mission. Roni convinced Phil to go along with the cunning plan of him using Phil as a shield in the upcoming charge, explaining to Phil that shoving some pencils up his nostrils would make him invincible to the cannons. In the end, their sergeant mistook the nostril pencils as a sign that Phil had lost his mind and decided to have him discharged on grounds of insanity. Roni pounced on this, saying that Phil was just faking insanity to dodge the draft and should be executed for this immediately, while he himself should be given an honorable discharge for exposing the foul traitor. The sergeant concluded from this that Roni himself was also insane, so they both got off the hook in the end. Roni explained the whole thing away to Phil by saying that there was a mix-up and they had never been drafted in the first place. Everybody else in the brigade died. The battle in question went on to become an iconic event known as the Charge of the Right Brigade and was touted by the Arvichian establishment as a glorious and valiant display of Arvichian courage and heroism in the face of certain death. The official state poet at the time, Edric Thompson, was swiftly commissioned to write a poem extolling its glory that was immediately declared Poem of the Year, despite it only being the 4th of January at the time. As a result of the government's and military's intensive efforts to promote the battle, it's still widely believed all these decades later that the charge was one of the finest and most honorable moments in Arvichian military history. However, in recent years, evidence has come out to show that the charge was actually the result of a catastrophic series of blunders and mistakes in which various messages were miscommunicated between military higher-ups, culminating in the Right Brigade being given orders that their superiors knew made absolutely no sense at all in the situation they were facing, but which they still forced the brigade to carry out on pain of death, despite the fact that following the orders was clearly going to get them all killed anyway, and accomplish nothing whatsoever in the process. It's still unknown why this revelation about the charge didn't come out earlier, but the military higher-ups, who were responsible for the original promotional campaign that accidentally and tragically distorted the truth about the whole thing, have vowed to hold those responsible for the charge and its cover-up to account. Farmy Phil famously went on record as saying he seemed to recall that the ones who gave him his orders were the very same military officials making this vow, and that they were also responsible for the promotional campaign and apparent cover-up of the whole affair, but Roney corrected the record in an exclusive tell-all interview he sold to the Arvich News by saying Phil can be safely ignored since he had gone mad and stuffed pencils up his nostrils at the time. In light of the revelations, and with a strong sense brewing among the family and friends of the dead brigadiers that their loved ones have been horribly wronged by the authorities, the military and state have officially changed their original characterization of the charge, which was that it was a glorious and valiant display of Arvichian courage and heroism in the face of certain death, to the brand new characterization that it was a glorious and valiant display of Arvichian courage and heroism in the face of certain death. Castle Officer Steele Foxington is so full of himself. Then again, arguably he's earned it. His Imperial Flying Squad strikes terror into the hearts of all would-be illegal immigrants trying to escape to Bestia. As a result of his 40 years of tireless service, he's been promoted to the ranks of Castle Officer and Master of the Royal Guard, making him one of the highest-ranking figures in the Arvichian, aka Destonian, military. He can fly rings around his rivals on his own, let alone in a team, which would make his 4-man Flying Foxes squad unstoppable if it weren't for one small problem. He recently had a bitter breakup with his much younger wife Foxy, who took their girlfriends, Cat the Poodle, Dodgy the Cat, and Trixie the Misshapen Rhino, to set up their own mercenary flying squad just to spite him. They're notoriously bloodthirsty, merciless, and above all determined to prove themselves better than Foxington's Flying Foxes. It's generally believed that Foxington alone is roughly a match for the lot of them combined, which would speak well for the Flying Foxes, if it weren't for the fact that all of them besides Foxington are completely and utterly useless. Bobsy the Bobcat was one of the first games made by notorious game maker LGN. He's one of their mascots alongside E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the Cheetah Women, Big Rig the Lightspeed Desert Bus, Squidge the badly drawn Bestian, the Stargazer Chi. Your system has committed an illegal operational dren, and many others. Nobody knows how LGN make games, or who they even are, but there's no doubt their games aren't from any excavations. The reviewers of Jove City made it their sworn purpose to call out LGN's games as horrible, and spread the word not to play them. However, they've been lying low for years now, and no one knows quite why. LGN have gone from strength to strength ever since, especially with the highly successful Stargazer Chi. Your system has committed an illegal operational dren series. LGN's game sets are different from any of those found in the excavations in a number of ways. First of all, they're all released for their own game set player, or console, as the company called it, the LGN Art 1, a system that launched for $599 Arvich or Domlars, which was seen as a bit pricey at the time, when the market rate for excavated game set players was around $30 Domlars. The console had some teething troubles, unfortunately, like the fact it exploded immediately upon being switched on. This problem was rectified in a later version of the same console, the LGN R2, which launched for $699 Arvich, and which actually stayed intact long enough to play game sets, along with some other new features. It came with a motion-sensing glove that was supposed to act as a controller, but players reported that their character just seemed to act randomly, and didn't respond to the glove at all. This glove was heavily promoted for some reason, despite how much of a worthless pile of trash it was. LGN responded to criticism of the glove by saying the poor quality had already been spelled out in its famous advertising tagline, "It's so bad, so customers had no right to complain." The console also had a built-in camera that took photographs of the player once every 5 seconds, and which couldn't be turned off, which LGN assured was there to improve the player experience, although nobody really understood how it improved anything. Despite these innovative features, there was a frequently reported issue of a strange red ring appearing on the lens of the system's built-in camera, with the countdown timer in the middle of the ring. The console would explode when the countdown hit 0, which tended to happen within several hours of buying it. Shortly thereafter, LGN proudly announced the LGN Art 3, which they claimed resolved the issue, when it came out for $799 Arvich. It didn't resolve the issue as such, but it did provide a new approach to the problem. Whenever the red ring of death appeared on the camera, the console would offer an option to upgrade itself to the next version instantly without it having to be physically replaced, using some innovative systems that LGN called downloadable content and microtransactions. As long as the player bought the upgrade before the timer hit 0, their console wouldn't blow up and they could continue using it. The prices for these upgrades were much lower than they had been before, but some consumers still weren't happy. And by the time the LGN Art 728 came out, people were starting to wonder if they were being taken for a ride. Nevertheless, although the LGN Art 1 wasn't very well liked, all their consoles have been extremely popular from the LGN Art 2 onwards. This is a point of great frustration for the reviewers of Jove City, who are completely bewildered by what on earth anybody sees in them. To the reviewers, LGN's games are irredeemably horrible, their consoles are overpriced piles of barely functioning garbage, and their microtransactions, undownloadable content are nothing more than crafty ways to gouge their consumers for more money, without providing anything of real value in return. In spite of the reviewers and their past campaigns, and in spite of all common sense and reason, people just can't get enough of LGN. Although they daren't say it in public, the reviewers have long suspected something sinister is going on. One of the biggest questions since the game sets and their players started getting dug up is whether characters like the Mario Brothers and Solid Snake Aeon were real historical figures that got their adventures represented in game sets, or whether they and their adventures were just made up. Opinion is very heavily split indeed, and the subject is known to trigger very strong emotions. Most are inclined to believe the characters did exist, and that the events of their game sets largely line up with reality in their key details, but that there may have been some minor embellishments in places. This goes against the captaincy's official position, which is that the events in many of these game sets would fly in the face of the laws of physics, and various other scientific considerations, as detailed in the manifest. In spite of this, many of the characters from game sets have developed what could be described as a cult following, and in some cases this can be taken quite literally. With the eons of any given species, e.g. horse eons, it's common to refer to them interchangeably with the label of their non-sapient species equivalent. Thus, a horse eon may also be referred to as a horse. In recent times, a minor backlash against this convention has developed, with some eons taking offense at being referred to by their non-eon species name. People who feel this way are broadly unpopular with humans, who find their objections pedantic and annoying, but also with their fellow eons, who generally feel such a deep bond with their spirit animal, that they take this backlash very personally. Eons who take offense at being labeled without the eon suffix tend to insist they're moved by the common perception that humans do indeed mean it in disrespect, and that many humans cunningly do it to sneak their anti-eon sentiments in through the back door, which is historically true at the very least. Ironically, eons are perceived to clash more with their own kind over this matter than they do with the humans concerned. Suffice to say, opinions are split on the matter, and so tensions rage ever on. While we're on the subject, inter-eon tensions are a rising problem in general. While many eons feel a sense of solidarity across all, or at least most, eon species, there are also many who hold other species at arm's length, or even hold them in contempt. It's well known that this sort of thing derives from their instincts to some extent, such as how Muse eons feel about kations, or Sherry peons about Wolf eons. However, the traditional spirit of broader eon unity is now being countered with a new tribalism, wherein eons of one species view other species negatively without regard to the primal predators/prey instincts they inherited from their evolutionary ancestors. This tends to manifest itself with eons viewing similar species in friendly terms, such as horse eons being on good terms with pony eons and donkey eons, while being less friendly to others. Paradoxically, the opposite tendency is also rising, with members of one species viewing those of similar species as rivals and looking down on them, while having more positive attitudes towards species that are less closely related. Suffice to say, opinions are split on this matter as well, and so tensions also rage ever on. Many eon-sympathizing commentators have expressed concern that this growing factional behavior within eon society is counterproductive to the common goal of overcoming eon's disadvantaged position in wider society. However, even this is a source of controversy within eon circles, as many see it as patronizing, presumptuous, and hypocritical to call out tribalism within eon subgroups in the face of the inherent tribalism of banding eons together collectively against humans, and they just want all the endless fuss about eons versus humans to be put to bed already. Suffice to say, opinions are split on this matter as well, and so tensions also rage ever on. As you might be gathering, opinions are split on a lot of matters, and a lot of tensions are raging ever on. People wonder where it's all heading. Most look to the Mower show, upon which many have made a wish to bring these troubles to an end. Demonics, aka vandals, are not to be trifled with, especially not Gulm, aka the mysterious one. Most people don't even believe he exists, he's so elusive. He rarely presents himself to anybody. It's said, though, that he would never do so without good reason. Nobody really knows what a demonic is exactly, but they're believed to be a supernatural creature from a higher, spiritual plane of existence. The demonics are addressed in the manifest. They are the foul underlings of Goskireth, and so shipmates are generally afraid of and highly distrustful of them, although faith in their existence is waning these days, in spite of the captaincy's official stance on the matter. Sir Bresby, aka Sir Nesbitt, is a close friend and confidant to the Holy Child, Gracia Gailey, aka Lewin Gailey. This is in stark contrast to his employer, Emperor Demaric, aka Premier Spons, who decries Gracia as a self-righteous little bleeding heart pie flake. Demaric despises the institution of the Holy Child, and for that matter also can't stand the captaincy, the manifest, or even the captain himself. Demaric is in fact a militant atheist, primarily out of his refusal to acknowledge the existence of a higher authority than himself, and he loves to rant about how much he hates that stupid captain, boasting about how much better he himself is, which some feel is inconsistent with his similarly boastful position that the captain doesn't even exist. They find it paradoxical that he takes pride in being better than an entity, that he takes equal pride in believing to not even exist in the first place, since logically if Demaric feels superior to the captain as a concept, then there's no real reason to take pride in the captain's non-existence, and if the captain doesn't exist, then it's immaterial for Demaric to take pride in the idea of being superior to him. Given this, it seems to some almost as if his fixation with relentlessly and self-righteously grandstanding on these mutually redundant positions is motivated chiefly by a desire to belittle others, stroke his own voluminous ego, and wallow in his oceanic sense of smug superiority to everything and everyone on every conceivable level. Demaric's religious views have led a lot of people to compare him with Grace, a comparison that infuriates both of them, Demaric, because he's nothing like that daft free wolf and what sounds like she's gargling apple tarts in cylinder acid, and Grace, because she's emphatically not an atheist, insisting the captain very much does exist, and that she is under no winging illusions that she's better than him, since the captain is all-powerful and superior to herself, and all mortals, in every way. And so grasping for some kind of high ground over him or hating him is a futile thing that can only increase our suffering at his hands. Despite popular impression, she has no interest in making people despise the captain. She just wants to spread what she's absolutely convinced beyond all doubt is the truth, and get people to wake up and stop surrendering themselves to any hope of meaning in life. In this way, they can perhaps have some fleeting sense of transcendence of it all, if nothing else, however illusory that sense ultimately is in the face of the captain's all-subsuming will. Yet her obvious strength of feeling on the whole subject led some to feel that she has deeper motives for her relentless attitude that she won't acknowledge to others, or perhaps even to herself. The Arvich Empire, which started as a country spanning the northeastern section of a landmass known as the Crescent, has since expanded over centuries to cover most of the known world. Other than the far west, which the empire has for some reason left alone, there are few places left that don't fly the Arvichian flag. The emperor and his government have never particularly cared to take an active role in governing the foreign colonized territories, preferring to delegate this to empire-appointed officials placed therein. Democratic imposes a mandate that all foreign colonies must satisfy a yearly quota of confectionaries, cakes, pies, and general meat-related baked products to be exported to his personal larder. Other than this, he shows no obvious signs of personal interest in any of the colonies, although in addition to the pie supply, many of the artifacts and treasures of these lands have been voluntarily handed over to Democratic by wealthy and prominent natives. A popular piece of Bestian rhetoric is to frame this as Democratic and his empire robbing these colonies of their wealth and cultural identity. This interpretation is vehemently dismissed by Arvichian authorities, who assure that the items in question are only ever given voluntarily as gifts by the native ruling elite, or the aristocratic equivalent of the countries, who were already in a prominent position before their nation was colonized. Some Bestian commentators feel this defense is overlooking the fact that said ruling elite are utterly subjugated by the local branch of Arvichian government, and that the gift-giving is almost certainly an act of submissive capitulation done in the desperate hope of currying the favor of their occupiers and making the best of their unwanted oppressed situation, as well as being motivated by the well-founded fear of what their occupiers might do to them if not buttered up constantly. Those few gifts given in this way that don't go straight into Democrac's collection are sent to the National Museum in the Crescent. This museum is heralded by Arvich as a glorious centralization of the world's culture for public display, in the heart of the brightest star in all the world. However, the common perception is that almost nobody outside of the upper classes goes to this museum and sees the articles, not least any immigrants from the colonies that the items mostly came from, or rather those immigrants who aren't caught and killed before seeing them. With very few exceptions, like Zibotsria, emigration of any sort in Arvichian territories is illegal, including emigration to other parts of the empire. This was mainly imposed on non-Crescent territories, after it was discovered that literally 100% of would-be emigrants are trying to get to non-Arvich territory, mainly Bestia. Some commentators have suggested that it's inappropriate for these antiquities to be kept within a facility at the heart of the Arvich homeland, when it would be more ethical to hand them back to their rightful owners. Arvich's response to this suggestion is the empire is the rightful owner of the artifacts, and the countries they came from, including those that Arvich later abandoned once Democratic learned they didn't have the climate or resources to produce his pies, and furthermore that only Arvich knows how to properly take care of the items in a manner consistent with imperial scientific and academic standards of preserving antiquities. Bestian commentators respond that they fail to see just how rightful and unwelcome conquerors' ownership of anything can ever be, especially with regard to items from ex-colonies that aren't even part of Arvich anymore. They add that the issue of how exactly these artifacts should be properly taken care of ought to be a matter for the colonized peoples and their own culture to decide, rather than their imperial subjugators and the abstract academic practices that Arvich has evolved within its own culture, which don't necessarily extend to its occupied territories except insofar as acceptance of said practices has been bludgeoned into their skulls against their will through decades, and in some cases even centuries of systematic cultural indoctrination. Arvich responds to these charges that there is no remaining evidence that Democratic was given the artifacts as gifts under duress, in an attempt to appease him, and also insists that the cultural indoctrination they are accused of was a friendly exchange of cultural ideals that just so happened to be completely one-directional in nature, which in itself is cited as proof that the people were and are fully complicit with it. Just Wally is one of Prince Median's old childhood friends. A 10-year-old Median was once presented with a picture show accompanied by wireless broadcast audio that was supplied by Just Wally himself. It was meant to show Median that his old friend was having a lovely holiday in sunny Zibotsria, to which both he and his entire extended family had recently and unexpectedly gone on an extended vacation without telling his best friend Median, or indeed anyone else who the young prince had been desperately asking about it, besides the prince's own father, Emperor Democratic. Prince Median reportedly got up and walked out of the room in the middle of the performance with his head hung low. Amid loud admonitions that the sound editor had used the wrong take, the projectionist nervously assured Median that Wally's agonized screams were just a joke. Coincidentally, the entire team responsible for making the presentation also decided to go on an extended vacation to Zibotria shortly thereafter. Shortly thereafter, Median was advised that his own mother, the Snakeon Anastasia, had gone on an extended vacation to Zibotria as well. It's been said that from this point on, the young prince seemingly shut down completely, refusing to leave his room except when forcibly dragged to public engagements, at which by all accounts he appeared vacant and distant, barely speaking, or engaging with anyone or anything present. This behavior continued for about 7 years, until quite recently when Median publicly disclaimed his succession to the throne, and left Castle Pasty together with a small group of close friends, and his loyal advisor, Grantak, aka Sir Grant. Those who have seen him in the months since report that he appears much livelier than he ever had since his mother's extended vacation began, but some have also expressed the sense that his attitude wasn't completely authentic, and that he seemed to be hiding his true feelings to some extent. This is Hermes is a valiant knight of buy things from our company corporation, CRTM, doing his usual rounds of screaming at everyone he comes into contact with about all the worthless products his Fleabit and company produces. Sir Mays has a notorious rivalry with Sirs Anthony Sullivan and Barry Scott, with whom he frequently jousts in a giant marketing spectacle, where his corporation shamelessly plugs their products with truckloads of posters and decks the knights out in suits of armor covered top to toe in brand logos and other such crass merchandising drivel. It has recently been said that a mysterious ninja woman has been seen hanging out in nameless forest villages' trees for some reason, far east of Edam, which is the place in which she was almost certainly trained. They love cheese in the far west almost as much as they love their steamed hams. Both parts of their culture have spread to the east, together with the production mechanism and its attendant political ideology that popularized them in the first place. Some would say we have the peasants' revolution to thank for that, although some would also say that thank may not be the right word for it. Little did the far west's aristocrats know that the strike action they invented in a bid to underthrow the tyranny of their underlords would go on to have such profound ramifications. At this point, it's a common sight to spot Western aristocrats begging for pennies on street corners and going on protest marches to campaign for wealth redistribution. The Western peasants now truly run the show with their corporations that the aristocrats had once laughed off as a doomed fad, and the peasants occasionally feel moved to toss their former overlords a few coins as they walk on, all the way to the bank, laughing. Several years ago, former Bestian President Borald Sumpson was accused of lying about basically everything he had ever said from the age of 4 onwards. Incensed by the very suggestion of this, Sumpson, his honor affronted and unable to contain himself, immediately made the righteously indignant rebuttal to this besmirchment of his good and honest character that you're biased and you can't prove I was always lying, which means you're wrong, as any honest person would say in response to such an accusation. It was later pointed out to Sumpson that the allegation was pronounced by the chairman of an official investigation into his conduct that had taken place over the course of 6 months and which had thoroughly analyzed the evidence for and against every single one of his truth claims being lies. Sumpson responded to this point that the investigators pro-baby didn't like him very much, so their 6-month independent investigation was invalid. Until fairly recently, Borald used to be the leader of the Libvative party, which has been the ruling party in Bestia for the last 5.5 years. Before then, the Concerebrals were in charge under Margaret Sumpson Jr., who coincidentally happens to be Borald's mother. Margaret's Concerebrals were famous for their desire to have friendly and peaceful relations with Bestia's former subjugator, the Arvich Empire, believing that it was important to try and rise above their differences and find a way forward together in friendship. While a surprising amount of the Bestian public expressed sympathy with this notion and spirit, they did come to feel the Concerebrals were taking this concept too far when they started to support Arvichian conquests of foreign countries and assist in assimilating them into the Arvich Empire. In particular, upon Emperor Demaric announcing his desire to get them lot over in that Persia bit, under my fat thumb, Margaret and her Concerebrals immediately launched an impartial investigation on Persia and concluded several minutes later that the country was secretly harboring a magical doomsday superweapon that could be used to blow up the whole of Bestia. The rest of the government were skeptical of the legitimacy of this investigation, and its findings, citing the complete and utter lack of any convincing evidence for the claim, besides their invoking the time 10 years earlier, when Persia withheld the fact they had blueprints on how to build mousetraps, until they voluntarily owned up to having the things, and handed them all over to the authorities without protest. Some commentators opined that the Concerebral's investigation and its results were little more than a pretext for their preconceived military invasion of Persia that the government cobbled together out of whole cloth with the sole purpose of fabricating an excuse for their utterly spineless and morally indefensible capitulation to the warmongering Arvich Empire's friendly request for military support in said invasion. This sentiment was lent some credence after Persia was conquered, and absolutely no trace of the supposed doomsday weapon was ever discovered, a result that had been predicted from the start by almost every commentator except from President Sumpson and the upper management of her Concerebral party. Upon it being put to her that this outcome, combined with the extreme skepticism with which most of the parliament and public had regarded the whole doomsday weapon idea prior to the invasion, suggested the entire basis on which Bestia invaded Persia was illegitimate to the point of arguably being a full-blown war crime, President Sumpson responded, "Let's not talk about the past, let's talk about the present," and thereby put everybody's concerns to rest forever. Other unpopular actions of Margaret's Concerebrals during the reign include the time when they pledged to abolish all tuition fees for students of Bestian magules, only to quadruple those same tuition fees several seconds later on the grounds that circumstances had changed since they made their pledge, and stating that in any case a pledge isn't a promise. This led some to question what on earth the point of a pledge even is, and whether it might in fact just be a way for politicians to sound like they're promising to do something good when actually they're not really promising anything whatsoever, and therefore can't be held accountable for accidentally making people think otherwise. There's also the time when Bestia was going through a particularly difficult time financially, in response to which Bestia's official clerk of finances decided to sell off the entire royal stamp collection, at a time when the experts agreed that stamp prices were at an all-time low, and could be expected to rise dramatically within the next few hours, which they did. Margaret's daughter is its own story. The owl in the tree is laughing because the little girl, Rodelia's voice cracks. The crying old rabbit is Granny Arbuckle. She still misses her husband, especially around Christmas time. The Giraffians are Doctor's Toys and Gina Arias. They were about to open a store. The Hippodones are Mylart and Junie Thine. They were expecting a baby. The Cowians are Colin and Cowette. They were going to adopt one of Tregish's orphans. The pair of honeymooning bunnyons are Jack and Bugsy. They had just gotten married. The gossiping Katyons are Polly, Nicole, and Cassandra, the last of whom also took the balloon from Spotty. They were attending Jack and Bugsy's wedding, until one of them was petitioned to leave unexpectedly. The monster watching the moon with Raulia's Enlo. They were in each other's arms. The dog's name is Spotty. He was attending a special event with his colleagues in the Pod Patrol. The Clayons are Grolice and Womat. They were looking after the orphanage for a few hours while Tregisha was away, entertaining the children with their inventions. The Hippoons are Muinman. They were helping to decorate the village Christmas tree with Jess the Katyon and all of his friends. The hermit is Snuffy. He was with his best friend. The wizard is Anderson. He was tying his shoelaces. And finally the singer with the gravelly voice is the Rinoion, Reuben. He had thought he heard a little girl wailing. It seemed to be coming from the village hall. He was going to check it out. All of them except one live in the infamous Quonus, aka Qualum, village. Or rather, lived. Back before the dragon diplomacy project fell apart completely, some dragons at least made a token effort to engage on friendly terms with what they still called eons. Gorwyn was one of them, petitioning young human children to come back with him to Dragonland, over the hills and far away, to teach them the ways of dragons. In time the children would return to their parents, although the stories they told didn't make people feel any more fondly of the dragons, reporting a lot of scornful looks and dismissive treatment by the towering creatures for all of Gorwyn's efforts to show the children a softer side to his infamously proud species. This batch of kids did help him to stop a diabolical wizard, as shown herein, which won them a little more respect from the wider dragon community, though said community still gave Gorwin all the credit in spite of Gorwin's own protests. The Dragonland that Gorwin spirited children away to is of course not to be confused with Dragonland, the dragon-exclusive afterlife that is now universally believed in by dragons, to which all dragons are supposed go when they die. It's not that they believe no other creatures have an afterlife of their own, they just don't care. Masculine loves to play ball with Dantares, but it always ends the same way. He just does it to humor her. They have a sort of big brother/little sister relationship, despite her being more brave and capable of fending for herself than he is. He even wonders himself why she latched on to him so quickly. He noted that she seemed to be similarly attracted to Grace in the early days, but that swiftly changed when they started clashing. Even now, the fiery masculine is typically the only member of the Mower force that stands up to Grace's venomous snarls, and the two argue a lot. The Wombles aren't part of the Mower show world, they literally broke in and interrupted the series just to try and promote their British children's TV show from the 70s. They're pretty shameless, but they're still canon. Also, Grace once again may seem uncharacteristically concerned when Dantares doesn't confront his fears in a way that she deems appropriate. In reality, Grace has had a long-standing feud with Dantares about Pajama Sam, a small children's wireless series meant to teach little children that fear is just in their minds, and scary things aren't actually threatening at all. Dantares adores the series, still listens to it to this day, and tries, and fails, to derive some comfort from its central message. Grace, however, practically explodes whenever he brings the broadcast up, crucifying it with exceptional fury even for her standards, and urgently warning him that the things we fear are not illusions, that terrifying things can cause us very real and indelible harm, and that it's important to confront and overcome them in spite of our fully justified fear of them. Unfortunately, nothing could be more unbearable to Dantares, so he only ignores her. It's been noted by her companions that these rants are among the most intense she ever delivers. A wireless is an old-fashioned radio, or something from the 1910s or so, which is the approximate real-world time period that the Mower show world's technology level has generally reached, although it doesn't have cars, phones, or electricity. It does, however, have the findings from the recent excavations, which is where such things as video games, game sets come from. Wirelesses were invented independently of those excavations, to be clear,